More than 200 Venezuelans illegally crossed into Ecuador Tuesday in an attempt to flee economic instability in their home country.
Venezuela, once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, is now a stark example of how economic mismanagement can devastate a country. Despite possessing the largest proven oil reserves in the world, the nation has squandered its natural wealth, plunging into a prolonged socioeconomic crisis. Hyperinflation, widespread poverty, and political instability define modern Venezuela, making it one of the most mismanaged economies in history. This is a story of a nation that had everything needed to succeed: vast natural resources, geopolitical leverage, and a talented population, but failed spectacularly due to corruption, poor governance, and over-reliance on a single volatile commodity. Venezuela's relationship with oil, a blessing turned curse. Oil has been the backbone of Venezuela's economy for over a century. The story began with the discovery of vast oil reserves in the early 20th century, which transformed the nation from a struggling agricultural society into a global oil powerhouse. By the 1920s, Venezuela was the world's second largest oil producer, and by the 1930s, oil accounted for 90% of its export revenue. The boom years. The wealth generated by oil allowed Venezuela to rapidly modernize. Urban centers grew, infrastructure was built, and the standard of living improved. By the 1950s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita. The country's currency, the bolivar, was so strong that it was informally used in international markets. In 1960, Venezuela joined Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq to found OPEC, giving it a direct role in controlling global oil markets. The government nationalized the oil industry in 1976, creating Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., a state-owned oil company that was intended to ensure the benefits of oil wealth would flow to the Venezuelan people. However, the reliance on oil revenues created what economists call Dutch disease, where the dominance of one resource stifles the growth of other sectors. By the 1980s, Venezuela's economy was heavily dependent on oil, with little effort to diversify. The Chavez era, populism and mismanagement. Hugo Chavez, elected president in 1999, rode a wave of populist sentiment promising to use Venezuela's oil wealth to lift the poor out of poverty. Chavez's administration implemented sweeping reforms, including nationalizing key industries and funding ambitious social welfare programs. The illusion of prosperity. Chavez introduced programs to provide free healthcare, education, and subsidized food. For a time, these policies appeared to work. Poverty rates declined, literacy rates improved, and the government's popularity soared. High oil prices in the early 2000s brought in a flood of cash, allowing Venezuela to maintain its programs and position itself as a beacon of progressivism in Latin America. However, this success was built on unsustainable foundations. Chavez's government failed to save or invest oil revenues for the long term, instead spending them as quickly as they came in. Corruption was rampant, with billions of dollars diverted to private accounts. By replacing experienced professionals in PDVSA with loyalists, the government crippled the efficiency of its oil industry. The 2014 oil crash. The global collapse of oil prices in 2014 exposed the fragility of Venezuela's economy. Oil revenues dropped by 93%, and the government, which had saved little during the boom years, faced a fiscal crisis. This triggered a chain reaction: hyperinflation. Inflation reached 130,000% in 2018, eroding the value of the bolivar and wiping out savings. Food and medicine shortages. Imports collapsed due to lack of foreign currency, leading to widespread shortages of basic necessities. Economic contraction. Venezuela's GDP shrank by more than 80%, one of the worst economic contractions in modern history. Corruption and institutional decay. Venezuela's problems were exacerbated by endemic corruption and institutional failure. The government's control over the oil industry created opportunities for embezzlement on a massive scale. Between 2003 and 2014, it is estimated that over $300 billion in oil revenues were misappropriated. Political patronage became the norm, with government jobs distributed based on loyalty rather than competence. PDVSA, once a respected oil company, became a hotbed of inefficiency. By the 2000s, Venezuela was unable to extract and export oil effectively, despite sitting on the largest reserves in the world. The expropriation of private businesses and land further deterred investment. Foreign companies pulled out of the country, unwilling to risk their assets being seized. As a result, Venezuela's industrial and agricultural sectors collapsed, leaving the nation dependent on imports for food and other essentials. A humanitarian crisis. The collapse of Venezuela's economy has led to a severe humanitarian crisis. Over 6 million Venezuelans, nearly 20% of the population, have fled the country since 2015, making it one of the largest migration crises in the world. Those who remain face extreme hardship, poverty. Over 96% of the population lives below the poverty line. Hunger. Food insecurity affects millions, with many relying on government food boxes to survive. Healthcare collapse. Hospitals lack basic supplies, and diseases like malaria and tuberculosis have made a resurgence. Crime rates have skyrocketed, and Venezuela consistently ranks among the most dangerous countries in the world. A stark contrast, Norway versus Venezuela. To understand what could have been, it is helpful to compare Venezuela with Norway, another oil-rich nation. Both countries discovered oil in the 20th century and nationalized their industries, but their approaches to managing oil wealth could not be more different. Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Norway established the government pension fund Global, which now holds over $1.6 trillion in assets. By adhering to a 3% rule, spending only the expected returns, the fund ensures long-term sustainability. Venezuela's short-term spending. Venezuela spent oil revenues as they came in, with no thought for the future. The absence of a sovereign wealth fund meant that when oil prices fell, the country had no safety net. Norway invested its oil wealth into education, infrastructure, and renewable energy, creating a diversified and resilient economy. Venezuela, by contrast, remains trapped in the resource curse, with oil dominating its economy to the detriment of all else. Venezuela's collapse is a tragic example of how resource wealth, when mismanaged, can become a curse. The nation had every opportunity to become a global economic power, but failed due to short-sighted policies, corruption, and an inability to adapt. Countries like Norway show that it is possible to turn oil wealth into lasting prosperity, but Venezuela's leaders chose immediate gratification over long-term stability. For the millions of Venezuelans suffering today, the cost of these decisions will be felt for generations to come. Without dramatic changes, Venezuela's future remains bleak, a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences of economic mismanagement. That's all for now. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think.